I'm Tom Hanchett. I'm Tom Hanchett. I've been in and around Charlotte since 1981. I work for the Historic Landmarks Commission, studying older neighborhoods, and materials online at www.historysouth.org. Then I work for Levine Museum of the New South. But I think the reason that y'all have invited me here is because I wrote a book called Sorting Out the New South City. And it's a book about how Charlotte got segregated. And when I say that to people, they go, huh, really? Charlotte's always been segregated. All cities are segregated by race, by ethnicity, by economics. That's normal. What I found was it wasn't normal. If you go back in most southern cities before 1900, not the end of the Civil War, not Reconstruction, but 1900, you find a sort of salt and pepper intermingling by race, by economics. And what I did is I mapped that for Charlotte in 1875. This is a quarter of Charlotte. This is the first ward. And basically the pattern is no pattern. It's kind of like salt and pepper, if salt and pepper were both race and economics. So that's kind of the baseline. And then I found this transition occurring around 1900. I said, why is that? Tremendous economic stress around 1900, a depression, a backlash as leaders sought to get control back from the electorate who had voted them out of office. And they very frankly used white supremacy. That's what they called it. An appeal to white supremacy to stir up hatred toward African Americans and literally disfranchised people using both a poll tax, pay money, and a literacy requirement, which were officially aimed at African Americans, but actually disfranchised a lot of folks. So that salt and pepper changes dramatically right around 1900 to sort of a quilt of separate black, white, rich, poor neighborhoods. And over the course of the 20th century, as local decisions, as federal redlining, lending decisions through the Federal Housing Administration, as that goes along, the quilt kind of, the pieces ease together until you get a sector, sort of like a piece of the pie. And today, still, Southeast Charlotte is quite well-to-do, where the rest of the city is not nearly as well-to-do. And that shift from salt and pepper to quilt to sectors turns out to be something, I think, that happens in every city. Because it happens in every city, it seems like it's normal, but it's invented. People create it, which means that we're people, we can create something new. Belonging is real hard to put your finger on going back in time. That map that I showed you of the first ward in 1875, all intermingled, I don't think people sat around in the evening singing Kumbaya with each other, but they knew each other in a way that I was not able to growing up as a white person, either in the South or in the North. I grew up in small towns in both places, and really had no personal contact with African Americans till I was in college. And I didn't know what I didn't know. And a book that I found very powerful on that story of belonging is by former President Jimmy Carter. And I think it's called The Hour Before Daylight. And it was about his growing up in the very rural South before the Civil Rights Movement. And at that point, power relationships were very stark. I mean, there was no fluidity. The white farm owners controlled the system, and that was it. But on the other hand, the knowing of people as people was much stronger than the world that I grew up in. And President Carter was in no way saying we should go back to the old days. He was just saying that geographic closeness breeds a shared appreciation of humanity, which sometimes it seems like we've lost. when you talk about people who are not native-born white, native-born black, it's important to start out by saying that the South had almost no immigrants for most of the 20th century. The rest of the United States was the immigrant magnet back in the 1880s, 19-teens, 1920s, when we had our last big immigrant wave. People moved places that were prosperous because that's where the opportunity was. That was not the South. And it really wasn't until immigration laws changed in 1986, shutting borders, and ironically, people who happened to be on this side of the border in places like California, Texas said, now what do we do? And kind of started looking at places like Charlotte. Also, the prosperity of this town, building its new skyline and all of that was a great attraction. So in 1990, we had less than 1% foreign-born. Today, it's like 15%, something like that. And where have those people lived? Well, most of that time, all of that time actually, is after the 1968 Fair Housing Act, the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act, where even though segregation and discrimination persist, the housing market is way freer than it was in the era when sectors were created. And so what has happened as these newcomers have come in is they've pretty much filtered into whatever neighborhood they could afford. I live on Central Avenue, which was an old sector entirely white in 1960, about 25% African American after the Fair Housing Act and Community Reinvestment Act kicked in. By the 1980s, Charlotte was about 25% African American, 75% white, so was Central Avenue. But as immigrants started to come in, there are a lot of apartments. There are a lot of small business spaces that had they were literally vacant. American business had gone carpet, moved to the mall. And when I first lived in Charlotte in the 1980s, I lived on Central Avenue because it was affordable, but it was pretty bedraggled. And I left for a while, came back in 1999, and this immigration thing had happened. Latino bakery filling up an empty store. El Pulgarcito, which is a family from Honduras, starting a restaurant in another store, and Bosnian refugees. I didn't even know where Bosnia was in Eastern Europe, making the best sausage sandwiches in Charlotte. Dang. And it's all sort of like an intermixture on Central Avenue. We haven't exactly gone back to salt and pepper, where I call it a salad bowl. I was brought up thinking that if immigrants lived in my town, they would live in Little Italy or Greektown or the barrio or something. But instead, they're all intermingled. And on Central Avenue, the longtime folks and the newcomers actually kind of get to know each other. And about 10 years ago, an immigrant woman and an old line Charlotte woman got together and created something called Taste of the World. We've got all these wonderful eateries, but you don't go to a new place by yourself, particularly if you don't know anything about the food. So, well, all right, let's get some little church buses. Let's sell tickets. Let's put them on the church buses, like 10, 15 in a group. That's a reasonable group. Send them out to some of these restaurants one day, and Taste of the World is in its 10th year. We're still not all sitting around singing Kumbaya in the evening, but we are eating the occasional pupusa. And I know Bosnian Muslim people. Growing up in the South, that was never going to be a possibility, but here it is. The increasing segregation in our cities is not something that just happened. It's not the market at work. It's not human nature. It is local decisions, but also national decisions. And let me talk about a couple of different national decisions. One problem with knowing all of this history, ironically, is it's possible to go, well, power always wins. I should just give up. Well, by digging into the history, you see that power has acted differently at different times, and the winners and losers are not predetermined. Redlining. Let me talk about redlining. People talk about redlining. What was it? 1930s, the mortgage market froze. If you remember the 2008 downturn, the mortgage market froze. Lenders would not make home loans. Same thing in the 30s. What do? Well, the federal government said, we're going to help banks, which is what we do when there is an economic downturn. But help make banks happy to lend. How do we do that? Let's send little guys around, and they'll talk in each city to the men of property and standing, the real estate leaders. They're the knowledgeable guys, and have them pick out a few neighborhoods that are really good credit risks, which turn out to be the neighborhoods where those guys lived, which kind of makes sense because there are a lot of people with money there, and if you want to lend money and get the money back again, lend it to people who have money. That's the way banking works. But anyway, so they kind of green line well-to-do neighborhoods. And conversely, they redline other people's neighborhoods. And that means African-American neighborhoods, working-class white neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are economically mixed. Charlotte's NODA, Mill Village, had mill managers and mill workers. The whole thing is redlined. The area around Johnson C. Smith University had college professors and working-class black folks all redlined. What does that mean? Well, you're a college professor. You have the money to borrow, to pay the down payment, and you can make the payments on a house. You're cool, you saved, and you go down to the bank, and they don't look at your documents. They look at this map that they have that shows that you live in an undesirable neighborhood and you don't get a home loan. And if you think about it, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It means that neighborhoods that are redlined end up being neighborhoods with a lot of absentee landlords. And it's really hard to have a healthy neighborhood where the people who own the neighborhood are not invested in the neighborhood, are not there to take care of the houses, are not responding to the things. I need to repaint my front porch. I'm going to repaint my front porch because I think about that every day because I walk in and out of it. And I know my neighbor across the street is kind of looking at me because she does that. But that's good because that's what keeps a neighborhood up. And so when redlining went in the 1930s, we had a couple of generations in which it was hard for black people, particularly, let's use that as an example, to own a house. Well, your house is your main nest egg. It's where, if you're going to start a business, you get a loan on your house. When I went to college, my dad gave me money based on a second mortgage on his house. When I bought my house, my parents gave me a loan for part of the down payment based on the equity of their house. So African Americans don't get that. Well, flash forward to the 1960s, and that becomes a big issue in the civil rights movement. Folks are not just sitting down at the lunch counter because they want a cup of coffee, they want economic access. And so in 1968, the Federal Housing Administration says, the federal government rather, says that, that you cannot discriminate in housing. That's the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And that means that anybody can rent anywhere, anybody can buy anywhere. And that still doesn't take care of this bias in lending, which by this point is built in. You don't need the maps anymore because the bankers and everybody else knows that those neighborhoods are bad neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods being neighborhoods that have an economic mixture or an ethnic racial mixture. And so in 1977, Congress passes the Community Reinvestment Act, which is the absolute opposite of redlining. In redlining, you pick out neighborhoods and say, we're not going to loan there, we're not going to insure there, whatever. Community Reinvestment Act says, can't do that. And we're going to be checking behind you to make sure you're lending in every single neighborhood. And it really makes a difference. In my generation, center city neighborhoods were slums or on the close to it. I live in one now. And it is a very nice neighborhood, but it wasn't 30 years ago because that investment had not kicked back in. And so, it's good for the neighborhoods, but it also means that my corridor of Charlotte, Central Avenue, looks like Charlotte. The largest ethnic group is still native-born white folks. Second largest ethnic group, native-born black folks. But every other ethnicity is represented within a 15-minute walk of my house. I tend to think I can do this on my own. And I've been doing this my whole life. I still use the reference librarians as my partners. And one of the key resources, if you get a reference librarian who doesn't do this or is just overwhelmed by all the possibilities, ask them about city directories. If I was marooned on a desert island and I had to research its history, which is the kind of thing historians think about, I would want a complete set of city directories. They come out every year. They're like the phone book, but they have lots more information. In my house here in the 1920s, I'm able to go to the city directory. I'm able to move back date by date until, poof, my address appears. And who lives there? I can find the name of the homeowner, the householder, usually a male. And then in a different part of the thing, I can find out who that person is married to. If she has an occupation outside the home, it'll probably be listed. His occupation is almost always listed. I figure out where he worked. Did he walk to work? Did he have to drive to work or something like that? The early directories up into the mid-50s indicate race, black or white. And so you're able to find, what was the business on the corner? What did your homeowner do? You can kind of imagine what the status was. Mine ran a barbershop downtown. So as handsome and wonderful as my house is, this is not a rich person's house. And it's also not a poor person's house. And so you begin out of that small pieces of data to put together a story of the people and the geography and the belonging of a neighborhood.